Pack your things, Sarah. This meeting no longer requires your presence. The words sliced through the refined atmosphere of the Belmont Conference Hall like a blade through silk. 11 CEOs occupied the curved mahogany table, their fountain pens resting beside memorandums of understanding valued at $1.8 billion. Afternoon sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric patterns across contracts that represented 18 months of my life. I had designed every element of this gathering. Seating arrangements calculated to diffuse territorial instincts, cuisine selected to honor dietary customs spanning 4 continents, interpretation equipment positioned with surgical precision. This space belonged to me in every way that mattered. Yet Matthew Kennedy stood framed in the doorway, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd already won. He didn't whisper. He wanted witnesses. From my right I registered movement. Ms. Okafor, the CEO from Lagos, offered me the briefest inclination of her head. It wasn't compassion in her eyes. It was understanding. She saw what was coming before anyone else in the room. I had devoted 17 years to Crest Global Solutions. 17 years of airport lounges where sleep came in 2-hour intervals between connecting flights. I'd sacrificed my brother's wedding for an emergency summit in Stockholm that no one else possessed the language skills to navigate. I spoke fluent Mandarin, conversational Japanese, and enough French to prevent the kind of translation errors that could demolish contracts worth millions. My position wasn't symbolic. I was the foundation upon which international trust was built, one negotiation at a time. Matthew Kennedy embodied everything that foundation opposed. Where I cultivated patience, he practiced aggression. Where I prepared contingency frameworks, he chased headlines. He'd occupied the executive suite for barely 22 months, capitalizing on agreements I'd spent years constructing before he understood the difference between a memorandum and a binding contract. He'd remarked once, in a corridor he assumed was empty, that the company needed fresh blood, someone who understood modern strategy. Now positioned before 11 of the most powerful decision-makers across 3 industries, he was transforming that private cruelty into public theater. I didn't rise immediately. My attention drifted to my chair, my designated position, now displaying Matthew's monogrammed portfolio spread open to his handwritten notes. The flush in my face wasn't shame. It was the sharp recognition that the meticulous planning I'd invested in this event had been weaponized to make my dismissal as visible and irreversible as possible. If you're new here and enjoying these powerful stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more. Let me know in the comments what part of today's story touched you most. I stood slowly, conscious of every pair of eyes tracking my movement. The temperature seemed to plummet. The warmth evaporated from the space, replaced by something that felt like Arctic wind. I didn't leave immediately. Perhaps it was defiance. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of 17 years refusing to vanish without acknowledgement, demanding I remember what those years had extracted from me. 17 years ago, I was an entry-level coordinator with an empty passport and a head crammed with languages I'd studied but never tested in real negotiations. Evenings were devoted to vocabulary drills. Mornings began with conference calls spanning time zones I still needed a world map to calculate. By year 4, I could transition seamlessly from English to Mandarin to French within a single conversation, identifying cultural nuances that saved deals from collapsing under miscommunication. Contracts were my expertise. Not the ceremonial variety with staged photographs and champagne toasts, but the difficult ones. The 30-hour negotiation in Beijing that concluded with a handshake 8 minutes before the deadline expired. The Stockholm crisis that pulled me from my cousin's funeral because there was no one else the Scandinavian delegation trusted to review the liability clauses. My personal life didn't survive the endless cycle of boardrooms and hotel rooms. The company flourished. That distinction defined the gap between Matthew Kennedy and me. I constructed trust methodically, conversation by conversation, across a dozen languages and twice as many currencies. Matthew constructed a persona. Designer suits, carefully crafted quotes for company newsletters, the type of executive presence that photographed impressively but dissolved under genuine pressure. Where I viewed agreements as bridges connecting disparate interests, he saw them as stages for self-promotion. I recalled a moment from 14 months ago, seated across from Mr. Laurent, CEO of a Paris-based pharmaceutical consortium. He'd leaned closer during a break and said quietly, I would not authorize a single euro of this if your name were absent from these documents, Sarah. It wasn't compliment. It was statement of fact. The signatures materialized because they trusted me to protect both parties equally. Yet Matthew had stood at that same podium 6 months later, accepting an Internal Innovation Award for that identical project. A project that had been seconds from implosion until I identified a critical mistranslation in the intellectual property clause at the final hour. He never mentioned my contribution. He never needed to. The recognition washed over him while I observed from the back row, hands folded, absorbing the knowledge that I'd just rescued his reputation from its first genuine catastrophe. Now standing in the Belmont Hall, that memory burned brighter than the humiliation surrounding me. I wasn't here because I'd failed. I was here because my competence threatened him. That realization carried the most bitter taste of all. Matthew's ambush in the Belmont Hall hadn't materialized from nowhere. It had been developing for months through small, deliberate incisions disguised as organizational improvements. The first time he introduced the phrase innovative thinking, it emerged during coffee in the executive lounge, delivered with false casualness that signaled boundary testing. The second instance became dynamic leadership approach, inserted into a quarterly review as though my years of proven results had somehow expired. By the third occurrence, it had evolved into redefining our global image, a transparent dismissal that nobody in leadership dared challenge. I'd survived long enough in corporate environments to recognize a hostile takeover forming. What I'd failed to anticipate was that Matthew wouldn't pursue a quiet transition. He craved spectacle and his stage selection was strategic. Today wasn't simply another meeting. It was the culmination of 2 years of negotiations, the day 11 CEOs from across 4 continents had assembled to formalize an $1.8 billion partnership. He understood the media presence waiting in the lobby, the executive assistants positioned on standby, the magnitude of what hung in balance. He didn't want my replacement buried in a standard company memo. He wanted my erasure to serve as his coronation, performed before the most influential audience he could orchestrate. 25 minutes before the meeting commenced, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Diana, one of the 3 assistants I genuinely trusted. He brought her. She's waiting in the East Corridor. I didn't require clarification about the identity of her. This was the strategic replacement Matthew had been cultivating for months to occupy my role. I remember staring at those words, watching them blur slightly. Anger arrived fast and hot, instinctive and consuming. But years navigating negotiation rooms had taught me the value of controlled responses. Fury needed to be contained, channeled, sharpened. Externally, I adjusted my blazer, verified the seating arrangements one final time, and continued as though the ground hadn't shifted beneath my feet. Internally, rage pressed against my ribs like something physical. I set the final briefing packets in their designated positions. A second notification illuminated my screen. This one hadn't been intended for me. It was a forwarded internal email Matthew had mistakenly copied me on 3 weeks prior. The subject line made my stomach contract. Media coverage, leadership evolution, Belmont event. The message body outlined specific instructions for where the photographer should position himself to capture the optimal wide angle of the incoming lead replacing the outgoing one. Outgoing. Me. I'd witnessed numerous cynical maneuvers throughout my career, but this was choreographed humiliation reduced to a playbook. He wanted my removal documented, packaged, and distributed as evidence of his visionary leadership transformation. In that moment, the sense of powerlessness was almost tangible. There existed no mechanism to prevent him from entering that room and executing his power seizure. But beneath the weight of that fury, I maintained grip on a colder certainty. He was walking directly into a trap he couldn't see. And my only requirement was patience. I had understood for some time that Matthew would eventually make his move. What remained uncertain was timing and audacity. That's precisely why the continuity provision existed. It had originated as a concept 8 months earlier during initial preliminary discussions for this agreement. I'd participated in too many negotiations derailed by abrupt leadership changes. A handshake held no value if the person who offered it disappeared the following week. So I drafted language that protected all participants. If the designated primary liaison identified in this agreement is replaced or removed at any point prior to final execution, all memorandums of understanding automatically become null and void. Simple. Neutral. It didn't reference me by name, but in every draft iteration I was that liaison. Obviously, it couldn't be presented as self-preservation. That would have triggered immediate suspicion. Instead, I framed it as respect for everyone's investment of time and resources. I employed every linguistic tool in my arsenal. Respectful, indirect Japanese for Ms. Okafor, the precise formality of German for Mr. Bachmann, and the nuanced tones of Mandarin for Director Wu. I explained how this clause wasn't about protecting individuals, but about ensuring stability. You invest months of effort, I told each of them privately. You deserve assurance that the person you trust will remain until the final signature. One by one they agreed. Some recognized it as protection against internal corporate warfare. Others appreciated the quiet leverage it provided them. And Matthew signed every draft without scrutiny, more focused on branding presentations than legal language. The provision was embedded in Section 19 under reciprocal commitments, a location he never examined beyond the header. I remember the moment Ms. Okafor lingered after a video call, her voice dropping to barely above whisper through my earpiece. If he attempts to remove you, we will abandon these negotiations. All of us. There was no drama in her tone. Just factual statement. It was the variety of quiet loyalty that couldn't be purchased, earned exclusively through consistent presence year after year, deal after deal. So as I stood in the Belmont Hall, listening to Matthew orchestrate my public termination, my pulse remained steady. I didn't argue. I didn't even meet his eyes. Because while he believed today marked his triumph, I understood something he didn't. The very act of removing me had armed the detonator. The provision wasn't empty threat. It was enforceable law, agreed to and signed by every leader occupying that table. Matthew had just invalidated $1.8 billion with a single sentence. And all I needed to do was observe it unfold. The continuity provision was only the first safeguard. The second was far smaller, far more personal. Small enough to fit inside my jacket pocket. Every memorandum on that table appeared final. Pages thick with clauses, signatures already in place from each CO. But those were preliminary drafts, legally binding in appearance only. The actual enforceable versions required one final component. My encrypted digital authorization. That authorization wasn't stored on any company server. It existed on a hardware security device no larger than a lighter, locked inside my leather handbag. I carried it everywhere. Stockholm, Lagos, Sao Paulo. Even today. The system had been my innovation after a near disaster 4 years ago when a competitor attempted to insert falsified approval while I was in transit between continents. I'd collaborated with our legal department to design a secure authorization process. Once my device was connected and my authentication code entered, the signature would validate and timestamp the final contract. If anyone attempted to access the files without proper authorization, the system would automatically transmit a copy of the attempted breach, along with every traceable detail, to my personal attorney. I could feel the weight of that device in my bag as Matthew paraded around the Belmont Hall, oblivious. He believed today's humiliation was absolute. He believed my removal had stripped me of every tool, every fragment of influence. But influence doesn't evaporate when you exit the room. It follows the chain of trust. And I still controlled the final link. In my mind, I revisited the moment the safeguard was created. 14 months ago, seated in my attorney's glass-walled office overlooking the financial district. She'd leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. The day he decides to destroy you, this will be your protection. They can't terminate your signature. Now, watching Matthew shuffle the memorandum packets like a dealer in a rigged game, I almost allowed myself to smile. He could install his strategic replacement in my chair, pose for the photographer, flood the internal communications with announcements about transformative leadership. But reality was simpler. Without my device, without my code, the agreement could not be finalized. The CEOs understood it. Their legal teams understood it. And soon Matthew would understand it too. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to interrupt the meeting. My control wasn't loud. It was quiet, precise, and absolute. Because in a room filled with paper, I was the only one who could make it legally binding. The moment I rose from my chair, the temperature in the Belmont Hall seemed to crystallize. I didn't speak. I didn't object. I simply stepped aside, sliding my chair in with the same precision I'd used to position it hours earlier. That silence carried weight, an unspoken communication only those fluent in boardroom dynamics could interpret. Around the table, fountain pens that had been poised over contracts lowered gradually. Pages that had been spread open were drawn together, closed, stacked with deliberate care. I caught the subtle exchange of glances across the curved table. Matthew didn't notice, or perhaps he noticed but misread it as indifference. He moved into my chair as though it had always belonged to him, flipping through the top memorandum like someone already certain of victory. "Let's proceed," he announced, voice filled with manufactured confidence. The first several minutes consisted of him reciting standard language, attempting to re-establish the momentum I'd built over 18 months. But momentum is delicate. It exists in trust, and the trust in that room had shifted with me when I stepped away. It was the CEO from Copenhagen who disrupted the rhythm. He leaned back in his chair, his voice measured but direct. "Mr. Kennedy, could you explain the implementation framework outlined in Section 23? The question hung suspended. Section 23 wasn't just a number. It was the cornerstone that balanced liability protection across 11 jurisdictions. I had written it, negotiated it, defended it through 19 revisions. Matthew had never once participated in those discussions. I watched him freeze for just a fraction of a second, his eyes darting across the page, searching for something, anything that would provide him a foothold. "Well," he began, "Section 23 addresses the implementation." "Without her," interrupted Mr. Bachmann from Frankfurt, his German accent sharpening each syllable, "who guarantees our terms are protected?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was an indictment. Around the table, subtle movements began. A CEO from Toronto closed her leather portfolio with a quiet snap. Another from Dubai capped his pen and placed it precisely in the center of his notepad. The Copenhagen CEO maintained his gaze fixed on Matthew. From the periphery of the room came a softer shift. Two interpreters, both stationed behind their respective clients, quietly gathered their equipment and notebooks. They walked toward the exit without a word. Moments later, one of the legal assistants followed. The sound of the door closing behind them resonated louder than it should have. Matthew's tone wavered, his sentences dissolving into incomplete fragments. He flipped pages too rapidly, as if speed could disguise ignorance. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full. Full of calculation, full of unspoken conclusions, full of the knowledge that this meeting was no longer advancing toward signatures, but toward dissolution. I remained where I was, several steps back from the table, my bag over my shoulder, my hands clasped loosely. I didn't need to speak to communicate. In rooms like this, silence was its own language. And right now it was expressing everything that needed to be said. The silence fractured not with a cough or a shuffle, but with the scrape of chair legs against polished hardwood. The CEO from Copenhagen rose slowly, smoothing the front of his tailored suit jacket. His expression remained neutral, but his voice carried the precision of a legal verdict. "As per the continuity provision," he said evenly, "our memorandum is now void. Without the designated liaison, there is no valid agreement." It wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. The words landed like a gavel in the center of the table. For a moment Matthew didn't move. He seemed to believe he could negotiate this the way he approached everything else, by pretending the words hadn't been spoken. "We can still move forward," he began, gesturing toward the folders. "We have consensus on they." But Copenhagen was already closing his folder, slipping it into his briefcase. Without another glance, he walked toward the exit. That was the crack in the foundation. From the opposite side, the CEO from Dubai stood, murmuring something to his assistant in Arabic before following Copenhagen. The Toronto delegate leaned toward her interpreter, nodded once and began gathering her materials. Matthew's voice rose, a brittle edge creeping into it. "If we could all please remain seated, we can address any concerns." They didn't even look at him. I stayed still, hands folded loosely in front of me, my bag resting against my hip. This was no longer my battle to win. I had already won the moment Matthew removed me. Now I was simply observing the inevitable play out. Mr. Bachmann from Frankfurt moved next. He walked the length of the table, his hand extended not to Matthew but to me. His grip was firm, steady. "You were always the agreement," he said quietly, his eyes locking with mine for a beat before he released my hand and turned toward the door. It was an affirmation not just of my work, but of the years of trust built across continents. And Matthew heard it. I could see the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of something behind his eyes. Anger, maybe panic. Near the end of the table, the CEO from Melbourne rose but didn't take her pen with her. She set it down in the center of her open folder, ink tip facing away from her. In certain circles, that gesture was understood. The pen left behind meant the agreement was over permanently. Matthew saw it too. He stepped toward her, voice cracking slightly. "We can resolve this. Just give me." The door closed behind her before he could finish. One by one, the seats emptied, the atmosphere shifting from tense to hollow. What remained at the table were untouched water glasses, scattered interpretation equipment, and the faint echo of footsteps on hardwood fading into the corridor. I didn't smile, not outwardly. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the composed facade I'd maintained all morning, there was a slow, steady pulse of satisfaction. The kind that comes when truth doesn't need defending because it's already walking out the door. I was halfway down the marble corridor when the first raised voice reached me. Even without turning back, I knew it was Matthew. His tone was sharp, fractured, the kind of edge that emerges when control has already slipped away. I slowed my pace, pretending to review something on my phone while the words carried through the half-open conference doors. "Get legal on the line immediately." Chairs scraped. Someone fumbled with the speakerphone. From my position just beyond the threshold, I could hear the clipped voice of our chief counsel through the opening. "Matthew, without the named liaison's participation at final execution, Section 19 voids all memorandums. And without her encrypted authorization, the system will not validate the contracts." There was a pause long enough for me to picture the expression on his face. Then his reply, low and strained. "We'll override it. You can't. It's hard-coded. Even attempting to bypass it would trigger legal alerts." Silence, then the faint click of a laptop opening, followed by a groan I recognized instantly. He must have been staring at the message I'd known would be there. Final authorization missing. Contract invalid. I took a slow breath. This was the part of the strategy one never had to execute publicly. The next sound was an email notification, sharper than the rest. I didn't need to see it to know it was damaging. My instinct told me so. A moment later, one of the junior staff emerged, phone in hand, whispering to another as they hurried past me. The words floated back in fragments. "From Copenhagen. Sent to the board. Said they don't work with instability." It was almost too perfect. I lingered near the elevator bank, just out of sight, catching pieces of Matthew's frantic instructions. Draft a statement. Market confidence. Strong leadership transition. No one uses the word void. No one mentions withdrawal. His voice kept rising as if volume could rewrite reality. But reality was already moving faster than him. I watched the communications lead exit the room, her face pale, her tablet clutched like a shield. Then another staffer left, murmuring something about checking with their division. The corridor grew quieter with each set of departing footsteps. By the time I stepped into the elevator, I could still hear Matthew inside, pacing, his words tangled with half-formed strategies. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sound completely. For a moment, I let myself smile. Just a small, private acknowledgement. I didn't need to witness the panic to know exactly what it looked like. I'd spent years in negotiation rooms. I could recognize collapse by its rhythm. And in that rhythm I could hear the truth. He hadn't just lost the agreement. He'd handed it to me. The cold air outside the building felt sharper than I expected, cutting through the adrenaline that had carried me out of the Belmont Hall. I walked slowly down the granite steps, each one a little lighter than the last. The agreement was gone for Matthew. For me it was simply transforming. Halfway across the plaza, my phone vibrated in my hand. The caller ID displayed a name I knew well. Okafor, CEO of the Lagos firm. I stepped aside, letting a stream of pedestrians pass, and answered. "Zara." Her voice came warm and steady, not the formal tone she used in conference calls. "I believe you have already heard the outcome inside." "I have," I said. "Good," she replied with a hint of satisfaction. "We would like you to serve as our direct consultant for the next phase of this project. Not as an employee of your former company. As an independent contractor. Full authority on negotiations and the budget to match." I felt the weight of her words settle in. Independent. Full authority. Those weren't just terms. They were a declaration. "That's generous," I said carefully. It's earned, she said. Without you there is no foundation for trust. We want the foundation. We spoke for another several minutes, outlining what would become my new role. The compensation was more than comfortable, significantly higher than I'd ever earned under Matthew's leadership. And the autonomy was absolute. When the call ended, my phone vibrated again almost immediately. This time it was a text. Mr. Bachman, Frankfurt. If you're available, we'd like to bring you on to lead our portion of the venture. Terms same as before, only if you're at the helm. 2 offers in less than 15 minutes. My steps slowed. This wasn't just about salvaging my career. It was about reclaiming the position I had always truly held, even when my title didn't reflect it. A third notification appeared. This one from an unfamiliar number. The message was brief but unmistakable in its leverage. We are prepared to sign once Zara Franklin is confirmed as lead negotiator. The sender's name followed. A major institutional investor I knew had been hesitant for months. I stood there for a moment, the city noise blurring around me. In the span of a single morning, Matthew had managed to lose the confidence of the international boardroom, while I had been handed the keys to it. It wasn't loud, this victory. There were no cameras, no headlines. At least not yet. But it was complete. And it was mine. I slipped the phone back into my bag and kept walking, not toward the subway but toward the quiet bistro several blocks away. Seemed like the right place to start drafting my own terms for my own future. After years of building bridges for someone else to walk across, I was finally the one deciding where they led. And this time I wasn't letting anyone else hold the blueprint. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows felt different here. Warmer somehow, as if it were illuminating a chapter I'd fought too long to reach. My new office wasn't extravagant, but every inch of it was mine. The desk was uncluttered, my leather notebook open to fresh pages, and my laptop sat ready, displaying the draft contract for the international venture I was now leading. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for someone to interrupt and pull me into a crisis I hadn't created. Today I was the one calling the meetings. A soft knock broke my thoughts. The door opened. It wasn't an assistant. It was Mr. Bachman, the CEO from Frankfurt. He stepped in with the same measured confidence I'd seen in boardrooms, but his expression carried something I'd never seen before. Personal respect. Zara, he said, placing a folder on my desk. This is the finalized memorandum for the joint venture. We've all signed. Yours is the last authorization. I opened it slowly. There was my name printed cleanly at the top of the leadership page, not buried in footnotes or legal acknowledgments, but standing in bold under the title, Chief International Negotiator. This time there was no one to override it. No hidden agenda waiting to erase it. I stood, walking with him into the adjacent conference room. The chair at the head of the table was larger than the one in the Belmont Hall. When I sat down, I couldn't help but remember the sharp scrape of my old chair being taken from me that day. The difference now was undeniable. This table was longer, the view broader, and the faces around it, more CEOs than had ever gathered in that room, were here because they wanted me here. As the conversation began, my hand brushed something at the corner of the table. I looked down to see a sleek fountain pen. Recognition hit immediately. It was the one Mr. Bachman had left behind on the Belmont table as a quiet symbol that the agreement was over without me. Thought you should have it, he said quietly, leaning closer so only I could hear. It belongs to the person who kept the agreement honest. I turned the pen in my hand, feeling the weight of it. Not in grams but in years. Years of flights, negotiations, sacrifices, and quiet endurance. Years where the victories had always belonged to someone else in the press releases. Till now. When it came time to sign, the room was still. No camera flashes, no staged applause. Just the sound of pen on paper, anchoring my role in ink no one could remove. I capped the pen, setting it gently on the table in front of me. For the first time, the victory wasn't about proving Matthew wrong. It was about proving myself right all along. And as I looked around the room, I knew this wasn't just a full circle. It was a larger circle. One I had drawn myself. 3 weeks after the Belmont Hall incident, the industry news arrived exactly as I'd anticipated. Crest Global Solutions had announced a significant restructuring. Matthew Kennedy was stepping down from his executive position, effective immediately. The official statement cited strategic realignment and pursuit of new opportunities. I read the press release from my new office, the one with windows overlooking the financial district. The language was carefully sanitized, but I knew what it meant. The board had acted swiftly once they understood the magnitude of what had been lost. $1.8 billion didn't evaporate without consequences. My phone buzzed. It was Diana, my former assistant who'd stayed loyal throughout. Thought you'd want to know. The replacement he brought in lasted 8 days. She resigned this morning. I didn't feel satisfaction at that news. Just a quiet acknowledgement of reality. You couldn't replace years of relationship building with a resume and a confident handshake. The door to my office opened. Ms. Okafor entered, followed by Mr. Bachman and the CEO from Melbourne. They'd flown in specifically for this meeting, the formal launch of what we were now calling the Global Alliance Initiative. Before we begin, Ms. Okafor said, setting her briefcase on the conference table, I want to acknowledge something. What happened at Belmont wasn't just about one man's ego. It was a reminder that in our industry, trust is the only currency that truly matters. And trust cannot be transferred like a title. The others nodded in agreement. We spent the next 3 hours reviewing the framework for the new venture. It was more ambitious than the original $1.8 billion proposal. This one was structured to expand over 5 years, with built-in mechanisms for adding new partners. And every single clause required my authorization to modify. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Bachman lingered. I heard through industry channels that Matthew is trying to rebuild his reputation. Reaching out to some of the smaller firms. Let him try, I said simply. Reputation isn't something you can rebuild with networking lunches. He smiled. No. It's something you earn over 17 years. After they left, I stood at the window looking out over the city. Somewhere in this same city, Matthew was probably in a similar office making calls, trying to salvage what remained of his career. Part of me understood that desperation. I'd felt it myself that day in the Belmont Hall, standing there as he announced my termination. But the difference was this. My foundation had been real. Built on competence, relationships, and the kind of work that didn't need press releases to prove its value. His had been constructed from optics and borrowed credibility. When the structure collapsed, only one of us had solid ground beneath our feet. My phone lit up with another message. This one from the CEO in Copenhagen. Contract finalized on our end. Looking forward to the partnership. Zara, thank you for showing us what real leadership looks like. I saved the message. Not because I needed validation, but because after 17 years of watching others take credit for my work, it felt revolutionary to have my contributions acknowledged in my own name. The sun was setting now, painting the office in shades of amber and gold. I gathered my things slowly, deliberately. There was no rush anymore. No crisis waiting in my inbox. No emergency flight to book. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that tomorrow, I'd return to this office, this role, this future that I'd built for myself. As I locked the door behind me, I thought about that moment in the Belmont Hall. The moment Matthew had said, "This meeting no longer requires your presence." He'd been right in a way. That meeting hadn't required my presence. Because by the time he'd spoken those words, I'd already ensured that without me, there would be no meeting at all. And now, standing in the elevator descending to the lobby, I realized something else. The best revenge wasn't proving him wrong. It was proving myself right. Not to him. Not to the board. Not even to the 11 CEOs who'd walked out that day. But to myself. After 17 years of building other people's empires, I'd finally built my own. And this time no one could take it away. The elevator doors opened to the lobby. I stepped out into the evening air, the city alive with lights and movement around me. My car was waiting at the curb, but I waved the driver off. Tonight I wanted to walk. Because for the first time in 17 years, I wasn't rushing toward the next crisis. I was simply moving forward. On my own terms. In my own time. Toward a future I'd earned, designed, and claimed for myself. And that was worth more than any contract Matthew Kennedy could have ever signed.